Yesterday, I posted a review of this Capturing Christianity debate. Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? Trent Doherty was one of the two people arguing that they do. Jay Dyer was one of the two people arguing that they don't. But the one interesting thing was in this intra-Christian debate, both of those parties, Doherty and Dyer, behaved very poorly to one another and to the audience. They were disrespectful. Doherty particularly was unhinged, bullying. Dyer was condescending and badgering, and it was just a poor presentation all around of Christian conduct. And one of the things that stood out to me is I have such a fundamentally different view of to think about worship, I believe, because worship was not actually a central focus here, at least for the yes they do side. Their focus was more on arguing that Christians and Muslims refer to the same being when they refer to God, including in worship acts. But what I want to talk about in this video is how should we think about worship? Because once we really begin to get a handle on the core of what worship is, I believe that will really change the way we begin to think about questions like this. And we will maybe stop thinking about questions like this in the very binary way that I think was assumed by everybody in this debate. So first of all, here's a passage. One of the passages I believe I heard yesterday when I reviewed the debate that I often hear in questions like this. So for people who argue that Muslims and Christians do not worship the same being, cite First John 4. This is how you can recognize the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. But every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming and even now is already in the world. Now you can take that verse, those two verses, and proof text them, and now have a proof text in which you can say that anybody who does not affirm the doctrine of the incarnation is the spirit of Antichrist, is opposed to the worship of God, and there's your answer, right? Right there. They're not worshiping God. The I've got all sorts of problems with that. Let me first of all just say this, that everybody is a theologian, and we all choose particular texts, biblical texts, Christians, when we do theology that are control texts for us. So those become the norming norms within our theological account of reality that serve as interpretive or heuristic guides to interpret other passages in the Bible. So if you choose this passage as your control text, so you begin with this assumption that anybody who doesn't affirm the doctrine of the incarnation is the Antichrist and is not worshiping God. Well, then that's your proof text. And now or your control text, I should say. It could become a proof text depending on how you have used it. But it becomes a control text and it now becomes the norming norm to interpret all other passages. I have different control texts. I don't start with this passage as my control text for addressing the question of worship. And I want to explain to you how I approach this question differently. First of all, I want to say, look, I think the debate between Dyer and Doherty and the other two gentlemen was assuming a particular understanding of worship, an understanding of worship that I suspect is critically tied to liturgy. And because these are Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox debating rather than, let's say, Pentecostals and Baptists, by liturgy, we really mean a formal liturgy, something that's written down and guides the order of worship in corporate settings in church. And that conception then is this, that when people think, well, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? What they're asking is, so when Christians get together, when Muslims get together, and they participate in liturgy, are they addressing the same being and worshiping the same being? And then, as well, derivatively, within that liturgical frame provided by that religious tradition, when they pray to God and undergo acts of devotion, to a ostensibly divine being, or are they worshiping the same being? What what that understanding of worship does is it centers worship on the individual and corporate group, um, just directed to God and performing actions like, saying particular words, utterances, doing certain performative actions like kneeling, etc. And that becomes worship. Singing, that's worship. In a more informal sense, you have similar assumptions in Protestant and evangelical churches. Obviously, many of them don't have formal liturgies, but they will have a music director or a music pastor that they call the worship pastor. And that really is tied critically as well to this idea that worship is about singing and praying in groups and maybe reciting a confession or creed together or something else. And that's worship. And I just think worship is something different than that. That's part of worship, but it's not anywhere near the root of worship. So I want to talk about that root. Matthew 22, when Jesus famously addressed what is the greatest commandment of the law, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophets hang on these two commandments. I think it's fair to say that if we're going to talk about what is it to love or to worship God, then to worship God means to follow God's commandments. That is actually a pretty consistent refrain in the Bible, right? If you love me, keep my commandments. And if you worship me, to worship is to keep my commandments. To obey is better than sacrifice. And what's important then is to note this, that when Jesus talks about the core of worship, which is keeping the commandments, he includes two fundamental commandments: love God and love neighbor. I want to propose my big paradigm shift is that we think about worship at its core, not as a liturgical, individual and corporate liturgical actions, performances, but rather as loving God with your heart, soul, and mind, and loving your neighbor as yourself. I'm not saying, obviously, that we worship our neighbors. I am saying that we worship God through the love of our neighbor. Very important difference there. And what that would mean is this: if you are not loving your neighbor, you're not worshiping God. I don't care what your liturgy is. I don't care what church you're a part of. If you're not loving your neighbor, you're not worshiping God. Conversely, if you are loving your neighbor, then to that degree, you are worshiping God. Now, note that I said to that degree. What I'm doing there is saying, to go back to what I referred to earlier, we need to get rid of a binary in our thinking about worship. It's like, are you worshiping God or not? But rather think you can be worshiping God to various degrees. And if you are loving your neighbor, to that degree, you are worshiping God. So, Genesis 1, here's really a foundation for this. In Genesis 1, human beings are described as being made in the image of God together. So if you want to know, it's interesting. Jesus famously says in John 14, do you not know me by now? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Jesus is the image of God. But we, human creatures, are made in the image of God, that is Jesus. When Jesus is not around, the closest you're going to get to an image or icon of God is the very neighbor in your midst, that human creature made in the image of God. To begin to love that creature is through that, like an icon, an image, through that flows worship to God because you are loving that creature. Paul talked about the supremacy of love beautifully and famously in 1 Corinthians 13, in the midst of a church in Corinth that was torn asunder by conflict, by debate and disagreement, particularly over the role and nature of spiritual gifts, which is so ironic because as Paul hammers home in this section, 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, spiritual gifts are about service to the community, about loving your neighbor. And the great tragedy is if you now rip those out of that context of service to your neighbor and you make them about the aggrandizement of the self, you have completely missed the point. And so this whole argument in 1 Corinthians 12 to 14 turns on the fulcrum of 1 Corinthians 13, where Paul famously says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mystery and knowledge, and I have faith that can move mountains, but I have not love, I am nothing. Even great actions, um, giving all you have to the poor, giving over your body to hardship. But if that is not out of love, you gain nothing. Love is supreme. Love of God and love of neighbor. That is worship. When you love your neighbor, you are worshiping God. And then Paul beautifully describes the very nature of what that love should look like. And let me just say, it didn't look anything like what I saw in that debate, in the conduct of Doherty and Dyer. So to be debating the worship of God when you are trying to bully and harass and insult and condescend to your fellow Christian in a debate is just a very sad irony. Perhaps the most memorable, if not disturbing, of these passages comes in Matthew 25, this famous parable of the sheep and the goats, where those who are sheep are distinguished from those who are goats by this. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. Verse 35. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to me. And they said, well, when did we do this? And in verse 40, Jesus says, truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. So if you want to love God rightly, which is the very embodiment of worship, it starts with loving your neighbor. Now, some people have read this passage and said, well, Jesus here is really talking about how you treat fellow Christians because he consistently refers to brothers and sisters as being the ones that we need to direct our love to. I'm going to stop sharing screen and then I just want to address that and say a few points by way of conclusion. Okay, I actually decided to keep this screen share and just put up as well the final passage I wanted to talk about. So in Matthew 12, Jesus is teaching. His mother and brothers are standing outside. Someone says, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. And he says, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And then he says, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. So the will of his Father is to love God and to love your neighbor. If you are loving your neighbor, who is the icon of God, to that degree, you are a brother of Jesus and you are or a sister of Jesus and you are worshiping Jesus. This is the paradigm shift I'm proposing, that we don't think about worship simply in terms of a question of how does your liturgy function, unconnected to the world around us. I think that is a and to think of that as binary, then either it is worship or it is not. But rather to think that worship is something that begins with how we love the icons of God that have been placed in our midst every day, the neighbors that we meet on the street. How do we love them? Do we love them? And if we do, to that degree, you are loving God at least, and you are worshiping God. That's where worship begins. And that says to me that a Muslim or an atheist or whoever you will meet who exhibits love of neighbor, kindness toward their neighbor, gentleness toward their neighbor, to that degree, that person is loving their neighbor and thereby to that degree loving God. So that's the first thing. It opens up our eyes to see the degree to which the world outside of the boundaries of the formal church, as we might envision it, God's love and presence and worship is to be found there. And it also, to go back to Matthew 25, says there is a disturbing part of that as well. If you were not loving your neighbor, as Jesus warns those who would be goats in Matthew 25, if you're not loving your neighbor, you're not loving or worshiping God. And that could quickly become an indictment of the church. And the bitterness, the meanness that I saw in that debate yesterday between Trent Doherty and Jay Dyer, when they're debating the worship of God, was, to my mind, an indictment of a large section of the church that has completely missed the plot because they've collapsed worship into the question of your liturgical form rather than understanding it at its root as the love of neighbor.